The bustling cafe in downtown Seattle hummed with the usual afternoon crowd as Mei Chen rushed through the door, her dark hair slightly damp from the persistent drizzle outside. She was running 10 minutes late for her first blind date, arranged through a dating app that her best friend had convinced her to try. The 28-year-old graphic designer clutched her phone, scanning the cafe for someone matching the profile picture she'd been shown. The anxiety of being late made her heart race as she quickly spotted an empty seat across from a man in a navy sweater, just as her date's profile had mentioned. Without hesitation, she slid into the chair, already forming an apology. "I'm so sorry I'm late. The bus was delayed, and then the rain started," and she stopped mid-sentence as she noticed the confused look on the man's face. The stranger, who appeared to be in his early 30s, wore a kind smile despite her sudden intrusion. His warm brown eyes crinkled at the corners as he said, "I think there's been a mix-up. I'm not waiting for anyone, actually. I'm just having my coffee." May felt her face flush deep red as she realized her mistake. She quickly glanced around the cafe and spotted another man in a navy sweater 2 tables over, who was clearly searching the room for someone. "Oh my goodness, I am so embarrassed," she stammered, gathering her bag to leave. But before she could stand, the stranger spoke again. "I'm Robert, by the way. And since you're already here, would you like to join me for a coffee? You seem like you could use a moment to catch your breath." There was something genuine in his voice that made May pause. She knew she should go to her actual date, but something about Robert's gentle demeanor and the way he seemed completely at ease with this awkward situation intrigued her. He was dressed simply in well-worn jeans and that navy sweater, but there was an air of quiet confidence about him that didn't feel intimidating. "I really should." May glanced toward her intended date again, who was now busy on his phone, looking somewhat impatient. She made a split-second decision that would change her life forever. "You know what? I'd love a coffee. I'm May." What May didn't know as she settled into conversation with Robert was that he wasn't just any stranger enjoying an afternoon coffee. The simple sweater and casual demeanor masked the fact that he was one of the city's most successful tech entrepreneurs, who had recently sold his startup for millions but preferred to maintain a low profile. Their conversation flowed naturally, touching on everything from their shared love of old bookstores to their favorite hiking trails in the Pacific Northwest. Robert listened intently as May described her work as a graphic designer and her dreams of starting her own design studio someday. He never once mentioned his own success, instead asking thoughtful questions about her creative process and sharing stories about his own early career struggles. As the afternoon light began to fade outside the cafe windows, May realized they'd been talking for over 2 hours. Her phone had buzzed several times with messages from her intended date, but she discreetly silenced it, completely captivated by the unexpected connection she'd found. "I should probably head home," May said reluctantly, gathering her things. "This has been surprisingly wonderful." Robert smiled that warm smile again. "Would you like to have dinner with me tomorrow? I know a great little Vietnamese place just around the corner. They make the best pho in the city." May found herself saying yes before she could overthink it. As they exchanged numbers, she couldn't shake the feeling that this accidental meeting was somehow meant to be. Walking home through the now gentle rain, she smiled to herself, thinking about how sometimes the best things in life happen when you sit at the wrong table. What she didn't realize was that this chance encounter would lead to not just a love story, but an adventure that would challenge everything she thought she knew about success, wealth, and what truly matters in life. Robert's secret millions were just the beginning of a journey that would test their growing connection in ways neither of them could have imagined. The next evening, May stood in front of her modest apartment's mirror, smoothing down her favorite dark green dress. Her roommate, Lily, sat cross-legged on May's bed, still amazed by the story of the previous day's mix-up. "So you just abandoned your actual date and spent 2 hours talking to a stranger?" she asked, both concerned and impressed. "When you say it like that, it sounds crazy," May laughed, adjusting her simple gold necklace. But there was just something about him, you know? Like we'd known each other forever. She hadn't told Lily about the upcoming dinner, worried her friend would try to talk her out of it. The Vietnamese restaurant Robert had chosen was tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. As May approached, she saw him waiting outside, still in casual clothes, dark jeans and a gray button-down shirt this time. His face lit up when he spotted her, and that genuine smile immediately put her at ease. Inside, the restaurant was warm and inviting, with the rich aroma of herbs and spices filling the air. The elderly owner greeted Robert by name, leading them to a cozy corner table. "You come here often?" May asked, noticing the familiar interaction. "At least once a week," Robert replied, his eyes scanning the menu he probably didn't need to read. "Mrs. Tran, the owner, she reminds me of my grandmother. Plus, the food here tastes like home." There was something nostalgic in his voice that made May want to know more. As they shared steaming bowls of pho and talked, Robert revealed that his parents had immigrated from Vietnam before he was born. He spoke about growing up in a small apartment above his parents' convenience store, helping stock shelves after school, and learning the value of hard work. What he didn't mention was how he'd later transformed those early business lessons into a revolutionary inventory management software that had caught the attention of major tech companies. "What about your family?" he asked, genuinely interested. May told him about her Chinese parents, both teachers, who had saved everything to send her to art school. "They weren't thrilled when I chose graphic design over traditional art," she admitted. "But they're coming around, especially now that I'm getting more clients." The evening flowed naturally, their conversation moving from family to dreams, from favorite books to embarrassing childhood stories. Robert listened intently as May described her vision for her design studio, offering thoughtful questions that made her think deeper about her goals. As they finished their meal, Mrs. Tran brought them Vietnamese coffee, refusing to let them pay for it. "For my favorite customer and his beautiful friend," she insisted with a knowing smile that made May blush. Walking back to her apartment, Robert surprised May by asking about her current design projects. She hesitantly mentioned a pro bono website she was creating for a local animal shelter. "Their current site is terrible, and they're losing potential adoptions because of it. I wanted to help, but I'm struggling with the back-end development." Robert's eyes lit up. "I might know someone who could help with that," he said casually, not revealing that he himself was an experienced developer. He wanted May to know him as a person first, not for his success or wealth. Standing at her doorstep, May felt a familiar flutter in her stomach as Robert looked at her with those warm eyes. "I had a wonderful time," she said softly, meaning every word. "Would you like to go hiking this weekend?" he asked. "I know a trail with an amazing view of the city. It's a bit of a challenge, but I think you'd love it." May found herself saying yes again, excited about the prospect of spending more time with him. As she watched him walk away, she couldn't help but smile, thinking about how a simple mistake had led to something that felt so right. That night, as she lay in bed, May's phone buzzed with a text from Robert, "Thank you for sitting at the wrong table yesterday." She fell asleep with a smile, unaware that the hiking trip would reveal the first glimpse of Robert's carefully guarded world, and test whether their connection was strong enough to bridge the gap between their seemingly different lives. Saturday morning arrived with perfect hiking weather, clear skies and a crisp autumn breeze. May waited at the agreed meeting spot, a small coffee shop near the trailhead, wearing her well-worn hiking boots and carrying a basic backpack. She'd been looking forward to this all week, even though her roommate Lily had spent hours researching Robert online and found surprisingly little about him. When Robert pulled up, May's eyes widened slightly. Instead of the modest car she'd expected, he arrived in a sleek black Range Rover. He must have noticed her surprise because he quickly explained, "It's better for the mountain roads," before changing the subject to their hiking plans. The trail Robert had chosen was indeed challenging, winding through dense forest and rocky terrain. As they climbed, their conversation flowed easily between comfortable silence and shared observations. Robert pointed out native plants and birds, revealing a deep knowledge of the local ecosystem. How did you discover this trail? May asked during a water break, taking in the spectacular view of the valley below. Robert's expression turned thoughtful. I actually came here a lot when I was starting my company. Something about the climb helped clear my head when things got overwhelming. It was the first hint he'd dropped about his business success, and May noticed how he quickly steered the conversation back to her. How's the animal shelter website coming along? As they continued their ascent, they encountered another hiker who clearly recognized Robert. The man's eyes widened, and he seemed about to say something, but Robert gave him a subtle shake of the head. May was too focused on catching her breath to notice the exchange. Near the summit, they found a perfect spot for lunch. Robert pulled out an impressive spread from his backpack, Vietnamese banh mi sandwiches from Mrs. Tran's restaurant, fresh fruit, and homemade chocolate chip cookies that he admitted his mother had made. You know, May said, biting into a cookie, for someone who seems to know every restaurant owner and hiking trail in the city, you're surprisingly hard to find online. Lily, my roommate, she tried to look you up. Robert chuckled, but May caught a flicker of something in his eyes. Maybe I'm just not very interesting, he said lightly. But then, after a moment's pause, he added more seriously, or maybe I just prefer to keep a low profile. It makes it easier to know when people like you for who you are, not what they think you have. Before May could process what he meant, dark clouds began rolling in unexpectedly. Robert checked his phone's weather app and frowned. We should head back. Looks like a storm's coming. They packed up quickly and started their descent. The temperature dropped rapidly, and the wind picked up. Halfway down, the rain began, light at first, then becoming steadily heavier. Robert pulled a spare rain jacket from his backpack and offered it to May, who had only brought a light windbreaker. As they carefully made their way down the increasingly slippery trail, Robert naturally took the lead, offering his hand at tricky spots and making sure May was steady on her feet. Despite the challenging conditions, May found herself enjoying the adventure. There was something about facing the elements together that made her feel closer to him. By the time they reached the parking lot, they were both soaked and laughing. I'm so sorry about the weather, Robert said, opening the car door for her. This wasn't quite the hiking experience I had planned. Are you kidding? This was perfect, May replied, wringing out her ponytail. Nothing like a little rain to make things interesting. As Robert drove her home, the heater warming their damp clothes, May noticed him taking a call through the car's Bluetooth system. Though he quickly ended it, she caught fragments of what sounded like an important business discussion. When she glanced at him questioningly, he simply smiled and asked if she'd like to stop for hot chocolate. Later that evening, curled up in her dry pajamas, May couldn't stop thinking about the day. She opened her laptop and, despite feeling slightly guilty, decided to do her own research about Robert. What she discovered in those next few minutes would make her question everything she thought she knew about her mysterious hiking companion, and whether their growing connection could survive the truth about who he really was. May stared at her laptop screen, her hands trembling slightly as article after article popped up. Robert wasn't just successful, he was a tech industry legend. His inventory management software company had revolutionized retail logistics, and he had sold it 6 months ago for $340 million. The simple, kind-hearted man who ate pho weekly at Mrs. Tran's restaurant was one of the city's wealthiest entrepreneurs. Photos showed him in expensive suits at tech conferences, but they seemed like images of a different person compared to the Robert she knew. Her mind raced back to all their interactions, his careful deflections about work, the Range Rover, the hiker who recognized him, the business call in the car. It all made sense now. Her phone buzzed with a text from Robert, "Had a great time today. Hope you're warming up okay." The normalcy of the message made her heart ache. She didn't know how to respond. Should she pretend she didn't know? Confront him? Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she finally replied with a simple, "Me too. Thanks for the adventure." Sleep evaded her that night as questions swirled in her mind. Why hadn't he told her? Was any of it real? The way he listened to her dreams of opening a design studio, was he just humoring her? The more she thought about it, the more she realized he had never actually lied. He just allowed her to see him as he wanted to be seen. The next morning, Lily found May sitting at their kitchen counter, clutching a cold cup of coffee. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Lily said, concerned. When May explained what she'd discovered, Lily's eyes widened. "So that's why I couldn't find anything about him before. I was searching for regular people Robert, not tech mogul Robert. What do I do?" May asked, pushing her coffee away. "Everything feels different now." "Is it though?" Lily challenged. "Has anything about him actually changed? He still took you hiking, still shared his mom's cookies, still made sure you were safe in the rain. Money doesn't change those things." Before May could respond, her phone lit up with another message from Robert. "Would you like to help me with something at the animal shelter today? I think I might have a solution for their website issues." May's heart raced. This was a test, both for him and for her. After a long moment, she replied, "I'll be there in an hour." When she arrived at the shelter, Robert was already there, dressed in his usual casual style, talking animatedly with the shelter director. His face brightened when he saw her, but she could sense a hint of nervousness in his smile. "I thought we could look at the website together," he said after they greeted each other. "I have some experience with web development that might be helpful." The understatement of that sentence hung in the air between them. As they sat side by side at a small desk, surrounded by the sounds of barking dogs and purring cats, Robert pulled up the shelter's current website. He started explaining some basic coding solutions, but May couldn't focus. "I know who you are," she blurted out suddenly. "I mean, who you really are. I looked you up last night." Robert's hands stilled on the keyboard. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he turned to face her, his expression a mix of resignation and hope. "I wondered when you might discover that. I should have told you sooner, but I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Afraid that it would change things. That you'd see me differently. The last few days with you have been the most real connections I've had with someone in a long time." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of his vulnerability. "Most people, once they know about the money, they either want something from me or they're intimidated by me. But you just saw me." May felt tears pricking at her eyes, but she blinked them back. "Why did you keep coming to Mrs. Tran's restaurant? Why take the bus sometimes when you could drive? Why live so normally when you don't have to?" A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Because normal is real. Money doesn't make life better, it just makes it different. Mrs. Tran's pho tastes the same whether I'm worth millions or nothing. Actually, I think she'd probably charge me more if she knew." The joke broke the tension, and May found herself laughing despite her confusion. But there were still questions she needed answered, and their relationship hung in the balance of what would happen next. Over the next few weeks, May and Robert's relationship entered a new phase, one filled with both beautiful moments and unexpected challenges. The animal shelter's website became their shared project, with Robert teaching May advanced development techniques while she brought her artistic vision to life. But beyond the shelter walls, they were learning to navigate the complexities of their different worlds. The first real test came when Robert invited May to dinner at an upscale restaurant to celebrate the website's completion. As they pulled up to the elegant building, May felt her stomach twist with anxiety. Her simple black dress, though perfect for most occasions, suddenly felt inadequate among the valet-parked luxury cars and designer-clad patrons. Robert must have sensed her discomfort because he reached for her hand. "We could go to Mrs. Tran's instead," he offered sincerely. "I just thought, well, I wanted to celebrate properly. No, it's okay, May squared her shoulders. I just need to get used to this side of your life too. She was trying to be brave, but inside, she wondered if she ever could. The maitre d' recognized Robert immediately, ushering them to a private corner table with a view of the city lights. As they settled in, May noticed several people stealing glances their way, and she heard whispers that made her cheeks burn. She tried to focus on the menu instead, but the prices made her eyes widen. Order whatever you like, Robert said softly, noticing her expression. Or we can share. I usually do that anyway, it's more fun to try different things. His casual attitude helped ease her tension, and soon they fell into their usual comfortable conversation. Robert told her about his latest project, a foundation he was starting to help small businesses adopt technology solutions. His eyes lit up as he described his vision, reminding May of why she'd fallen for him in the first place. I'd love your input on the foundation's branding, he said, then quickly added, not as a girlfriend favor, but as a professional commission. Your work is exactly what we need. Before May could respond, a well-dressed couple approached their table. The woman's eyes darted between them with poorly concealed curiosity. Robert. What a surprise seeing you here, she said, though her tone suggested it wasn't a surprise at all. Robert stood politely. Mrs. Chen, Mr. Chen, good to see you. He turned to May. This is Jennifer and David Chen. They were early investors in my company. Then, with obvious pride in his voice, he added, and this is May, an incredibly talented graphic designer who's helping launch my new foundation. The conversation that followed was a blur of business terms and not so subtle probing questions about May's background. She found herself grateful for her parents' insistence on proper manners as she navigated the exchange. When the Chens finally left, Robert apologized, but May surprised herself by laughing. You know what's funny, she said, taking a sip of wine. They probably think you're with me because I'm Asian and from a good family. They have no idea I sat at your table by mistake and nearly spilled coffee on you. Robert's relief at her humor was visible. That's exactly why I love you, he said, then froze, realizing what he'd just admitted. The words hung in the air between them, unexpected but not unwelcome. May reached across the table and squeezed his hand. I love you too, she said softly. Not because of your money or your success, but because you're the kind of person who helps build websites for animal shelters and remembers exactly how I like my foe. That evening marked a turning point. Over dessert, they talked openly about their fears and hopes. Robert confessed that his last relationship had ended because his ex-girlfriend had been more interested in his wealth than in him. May shared her worries about fitting into his world and maintaining her independence. I don't want to be seen as the girl who got lucky by meeting a rich guy, she explained. I have my own dreams, my own goals. That's exactly why this works, Robert replied. You saw me as a person before you knew about the money. And I see you, all of you. Your talent, your determination, your kindness. That's what matters. As they left the restaurant, a photographer snapped their picture. Robert instinctively moved to block May from view, but she straightened her shoulders and took his hand instead. It's okay, she said. I'm not hiding. We're not hiding. The next morning, their photo appeared on a local news website with the headline, Tech Millionaire's New Romance. May's phone exploded with messages from friends and family, including an excited call from her mother who had already begun planning an elaborate family dinner. But as May sat in her small apartment, looking at the article, she realized something important. The woman in the photo, smiling confidently beside Robert, didn't look out of place at all. She looked like she belonged, not because of where they were or what they were wearing, but because of the way they looked at each other. The weeks following their public debut brought changes that neither May nor Robert had fully anticipated. Their sweet, private romance suddenly became fodder for local gossip columns and tech industry blogs. Every coffee run, every dinner date, every casual walk through the park seemed to attract curious eyes and occasional photographers. The animal shelter website launched successfully, bringing in a wave of new adoptions. But instead of celebrating their joint achievement, the local tech blogs focused on their relationship, some even suggesting that May had orchestrated the wrong table meeting. The comments stung, but what hurt more was watching Robert's anger when he read them. "They don't know you," he said one evening, as they sat in his apartment's kitchen. He was stress cooking Vietnamese food, something May had learned he did when upset. "They don't know how talented you are, how hard you work." May watched him aggressively chop vegetables. "Hey," she said softly, placing her hand over his. "Their opinions don't matter. We know the truth." That weekend, they escaped the city, driving up the coast in Robert's old Jeep, not the Range Rover. They found a quiet beach where no one knew them. As they walked along the shore, Robert talked about his parents' early struggles in America, how they'd saved every penny from their convenience store to give him an education. "You know what my dad told me when I sold the company?" Robert said, picking up a smooth stone and skipping it across the waves. "He said, money changes how others see you, but it shouldn't change how you see yourself." May squeezed his hand. "Your dad is very wise. He also said I should marry you before someone else sits at your table by mistake," Robert added with a grin, making May laugh and blush simultaneously. Back in the city, May threw herself into her work. The foundation's branding project had opened doors to other high-profile clients, and her small freelance business was growing rapidly. She insisted on maintaining her own apartment, even though she spent most nights at Robert's place. "I need to know I can stand on my own," she explained, and Robert understood. One morning, while working from her favorite cafe, not the one where they'd met, May overheard two women discussing her relationship. "She's so lucky," one said. "Imagine meeting a millionaire by accident." May wanted to turn around and tell them about the real Robert, the one who still helped his parents inventory their store every month, who knew every dog's name at the shelter, who couldn't cook rice without burning it despite his heritage. Instead, she packed up her laptop and walked to Mrs. Tran's restaurant. The elderly woman took one look at May's face and brought her a bowl of pho without asking. "Love is not easy," Mrs. Tran said, sitting down across from her. "But real love is worth the trouble." "How did you know?" May asked. "That first night when Robert brought me here, you smiled like you knew something." Mrs. Tran's eyes twinkled. "I've known Robert since before his success. He would come here to study, too busy coding to eat properly. I made sure he didn't starve. When he brought you here, I saw how he looked at you, not like a man showing off his favorite restaurant, but like a man sharing part of his heart." That conversation with Mrs. Tran gave May an idea. The next day, she started a project of her own, a series of illustrations chronicling their story. Not the sensational version the media loved, but the real one, two people finding each other by accident, learning to trust, navigating two different worlds while building their own. When the series was complete, she showed it to Robert first. He sat in her small studio, looking through each piece with tears in his eyes. The final illustration showed them at Mrs. Tran's restaurant, sharing pho, with the words, "The best things in life happen by accident," written in both English and Vietnamese. "This is us," he said simply. "The real us." May posted the series on her professional website without fanfare. Within days, it went viral, not for the romance with a millionaire angle, but for its honest portrayal of modern love. Art galleries reached out, wanting to showcase the series. Tech companies contacted her about commissioned work. But the response that meant the most came from a young artist who wrote, "Thank you for showing that success doesn't change who you are, it reveals who you've been all along." Robert supported her growing success with pride, never once trying to influence her career with his connections. Instead, he became her biggest cheerleader, attending every gallery showing, bragging about her talent to anyone who would listen. One evening, after a particularly successful gallery opening, they returned to their favorite cafe, the one where it all began. The same table was empty, as if waiting for them. As they sat down, Robert reached across the table, just as he had that first day. "You know," he said, "sitting at the wrong table was the best mistake I ever made." May smiled, remembering her embarrassment that day. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd gone to the right table?" "Sometimes," Robert admitted. "But then I remember something my mother once told me: there are no wrong tables, only unexpected blessings." As they sat there, sharing a piece of cake and planning their future, neither of them noticed the curious glances from other customers. They were too busy being themselves, not the tech millionaire and the artist, not the power couple from the magazines, just May and Robert, two people who found love by accident and chose it on purpose. 1 year after their accidental meeting, May's illustration series had transformed into a traveling exhibition called The Wrong Table, showcasing stories of serendipitous love from around the world. Her work had gained recognition not because of her relationship with Robert, but because of her authentic portrayal of modern relationships and the way fate sometimes has better plans than we do. On a crisp autumn morning, similar to the day they first met, May stood in the gallery space arranging the final pieces for the Seattle showing. Robert was supposed to meet her there, but he'd texted saying he was running late, something about helping his parents at the store. She smiled, knowing he still insisted on doing monthly inventory with them, even though he'd helped modernize their entire system. The exhibition space was quiet except for the soft footsteps of the gallery staff preparing for the evening's opening. May walked through the displayed pieces, each one telling a different story of chance encounters and unexpected love. Her original series about their story remained the centerpiece, but it had grown into something bigger than just their narrative. The door chimed, and May turned, expecting to see Robert. Instead, she found Mrs. Tran standing there, looking slightly out of place in the modern gallery but wearing a knowing smile. "My dear," she said, holding out a paper bag that smelled like fresh banh mi, "you must eat before your big night." "Mrs. Tran. How did you know I was here?" May asked, accepting the bag gratefully. The elderly woman's eyes twinkled. "A little bird told me. Now come, sit with me for a moment." She gestured to a nearby bench, and May joined her, suddenly realizing how hungry she was. As they shared the sandwich, Mrs. Tran looked around at the artwork. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "when Robert first started coming to my restaurant, he was so focused on his computer, I had to force him to eat. But he always treated me with respect, like family. Money didn't change that about him. And when he brought you that first time, I knew something was different. He wasn't hiding anymore." May listened, touched by Mrs. Tran's words. "Sometimes I still wonder if it was really an accident, sitting at his table that day." "Life gives us gifts in strange packages," Mrs. Tran replied. "The trick is recognizing them when they come." She stood up, straightening her simple dress. "Now, I should go. I have a special dinner to prepare for tonight." Before May could ask what she meant, Mrs. Tran had disappeared, leaving May to wonder about her cryptic words. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of last-minute preparations. Robert texted again, apologizing for being late but promising to be there for the opening. As evening approached, guests began arriving: art collectors, fellow artists, tech industry figures, and even some couples whose stories were featured in the exhibition. May's parents arrived early, her mother fussing over her dress while her father pretended not to be emotional about his daughter's success. Robert's parents came too, bringing traditional Vietnamese sweets they'd made specially for the occasion. May watched as their families naturally gravitated toward each other, sharing stories and laughs despite their different backgrounds. It was everything she'd hoped for but hadn't dared to expect when she first learned about Robert's true identity. The gallery was packed and May noticed something odd. People were being quietly directed toward the central space where her original series hung. She made her way through the crowd, curious about the commotion. There, in front of the first illustration, the one showing their accidental meeting, stood Robert. He'd changed from his usual casual attire into a suit, but not the expensive kind he wore to business meetings. This one looked more like something he'd have worn that first day, if he'd been dressed up for a date. As May approached, the crowd parted, and she saw that the illustration had been temporarily replaced with a new one, clearly drawn in her style, but not by her hand. It showed Robert kneeling in front of her, holding something small and sparkling. Her heart stopped as she realized what was happening. The real Robert turned to face her, dropping to one knee just like in the illustration. "May," he said, his voice carrying in the now silent gallery, "1 year ago, you sat at the wrong table and changed my life forever. You showed me that real love isn't about what you have or who you're supposed to be, it's about who you are when you're together." He pulled out a small box, but instead of opening it immediately, he reached into his pocket and produced a familiar-looking paper napkin. "Before I ask the big question, I want to show you something. Remember how we met? Well, I kept this napkin from that day. On it, I wrote, 'The most beautiful girl just sat at my table by mistake. I hope she stays.'" Tears welled in May's eyes as she recognized the cafe's logo on the napkin. Robert continued, "You did stay, and you've shown me every day since then that the best things in life aren't planned, they're the beautiful accidents that lead us exactly where we're meant to be." Finally opening the box, he revealed a ring that perfectly balanced elegance and simplicity. "So now I'm asking, will you stay forever? Will you marry me?" Through her tears, May saw their families together, Mrs. Tran beaming from beside them, Lily recording everything on her phone, and the gallery full of people who knew their story, not as a headline about a millionaire and an artist, but as a tale of two people who found each other by chance and chose each other on purpose. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, I'll stay." As Robert slipped the ring onto her finger, the gallery erupted in applause. But May barely heard it as she pulled him to his feet and into a kiss. When they finally parted, she whispered, "Did you really write that on the napkin that first day?" Robert grinned sheepishly. "Actually, I wrote it after you left. I was too nervous while you were there, my hands were shaking." Later that night, after the crowds had gone and their families had headed home with promises of engagement celebration plans, May and Robert sat at their table in the empty cafe where it all began. Mrs. Tran had insisted on keeping the restaurant open late just for them, serving them the same dishes they'd shared on their first real date. To sitting at the wrong table, Robert toasted with his Vietnamese coffee. "To beautiful mistakes," May replied, clinking her cup against his. As they sat there, planning their future between bites of pho and laughter, they both knew that some accidents aren't accidents at all, they're life's way of leading us exactly where we need to be.